2641 Marathon Battle. The gears of war were turning. In the northern reaches of the Eternal City, the Dutchman and its Wraith army were engaged in a ferocious battle against the corrupted Immortals, slowly pushing their way toward the palace. In the southernmost part of the city, the Shadow Legion had conquered a foothold and was now preparing to advance. Far in the east, the colossal clock tower oversaw the silent streets. In the west, the lighthouse shone with radiant silver light. Sunny felt a sense of urgency as he commanded his shades to march north. This is not at all like the burned forest. His campaign to conquer the outskirts of the burned forest had been a slow affair. Fierce skirmishes had been followed by swift retreats and prolonged periods of relative peace. Sunny would dismiss the remaining shades and evade the pursuing black millipedes alone, waiting for his growing legion to restore itself and wage another battle. It had been like a harrowing game of cat and mouse. The battle for the Eternal City was going to be different. Soon enough, the Shadow Legion was going to clash with the fallen Immortals once again, and once it did, there would be no pause and no reprieve from the daunting violence of war until it was all over, one way or another. That marathon battle was going to be far more strategic and involve far more moving parts, as well, so he expected to suffer unimaginable mental strain and truly put Mindweave to the test, exploring its very limits. Sunny did not feel wary or apprehensive, though. He did not feel particularly excited or on edge, either. Instead, he was calm and collected, full of focus and grounded determination. After all, war was nothing new to him after all these years. Time is running out. At the moment, his 5 incarnations had split up, and so did the Shadow Legion. There were 3 islands bordering the one connected to the wharf. Therefore, one of his incarnations was retreating back to the Night Garden with Jet. They were going to sail along the edges of the Eternal City and make landfall directly at the lighthouse. The second incarnation was augmenting the puppeteer atop the Dark Castle, and the remaining 3 were accompanying different contingents of the Shadow Legion, each moving toward one of the island bridges. The first contingent was led by Saint, who was supported by Fiend. The third contingent was led by Slayer, with Serpent keeping her company. The second contingent was a bit special, since that one was the smallest and led directly by Sunny and the puppeteer Moth. This is going to be interesting. Sunny's consciousness split between the innumerable shades of his legions, spread across 3 advancing forces, with the puppeteer serving as the focal point of the entire army. Intangible strings of black silk spread in the sky above the Eternal City, visible only to Sunny. The Saint army reached the edge of the island first. Out there, the ornate buildings receded, opening to a vast emptiness. Far below, raging currents crashed into the basalt foundation of the city, foaming as they rushed with terrible speed. A wide bridge arched as it spanned half a dozen kilometers that separated the 2 islands, and on the other side, the fallen Immortals were already moving between buildings. Sunny observed the vast chasm and the dark water seething at its bottom, wondering if the Eternal City had always been separated into islands or if it had shattered while plummeting from the black skies to the bottom of the sea. In any case, falling down seemed like a bad idea. It was not that creatures of the caliber present in the Eternal City would be severely damaged in the fall or had no ways of climbing back up, but rather the fact that the elevation difference would give their enemies a deadly advantage. More than that, he could vaguely sense movement in the water. There had to be some kind of abominable beings dwelling at the bottom of the Eternal City, and from the looks of it, they were different from the corrupted Immortals. The breathtaking youth seemed to be wary of the edges of the islands, at least, which made him feel reluctant to dive into the dark waters himself. How curious. What could these immortal fiends fear? Sunny hoped to never find out. In any case, that did not matter at the moment. The form of the bridge itself dictated the nature of the battle. Since it was arched, the side that controlled its crest would possess a minor advantage. It would face the enemy from an elevated position, while the enemy would have to fight on an upward slope. So, Saint and her soldiers had to occupy the crest as soon as possible. That could be accomplished easily enough. As the first of the Immortals rushed across the bridge, the colossal figure of Fiend dove into the shadows. Usually, using Shadow Step was a swift ordeal. All one had to do was enter the shadows and step out of them. However, due to Fiend's prodigious size, the simple act of submerging his towering body into the embrace of shadows took some time. He still rose from the shadows on the crest of the bridge before the Immortals, though. The infernal colossus of blackened steel met them with a torrent of flames, incinerating their abominable bodies. By the time they were revived, Saints and her shades had already caught up to him, building an orderly formation and advancing at a steady march. At the forefront of the Saint army were the shadows of Godgrave and a large number of grotesque millipedes, their long bodies encased in impenetrable black chitin. Once Saint took control of the crest of the wide bridge, the strategy of her army became simple. She built an indestructible bulwark and allowed the enemies to crush themselves against it. Saint stood in front of her soldiers, clad in fearsome jade armor and wielding her usual round shield. Fiend was beside her, as well, with his indestructible steel body. Behind them was a wall of black chitin, with the grotesque shadows of Godgrave serving as the fangs of the largely defensive formation. Saints regarded the approaching immortals with her usual air of indifference, and then hit the rim of her shield twice. Fiend let out a thunderous roar, and behind him, numerous millipedes clicked their mandibles, causing a loud rumbling to roll across the bridge. In the next moment, an avalanche of abhorrent flesh collided against the formation of Saint's army, and all hell broke loose. 2642 Three Bridges. At the same time as the Saint army entered the battle for the western bridge, the Slayer army reached the eastern span of the chasm. Here, the landscape was rather similar, except for the fact that the Great Bridge was flat as opposed to arched and not quite as wide. The battle was very different, though. As the torrent of fallen immortals entered the bridge, rushing across its surface like a distressing tide, a cold wind blew across the chasm. Then, something glistened in the air. It was a snowflake, one at first, then one more, then an endless number of them. In a strange turn of events, on that day, snow fell at the bottom of the Stormzia. The winds howled, reaching a frightening speed and intensity, and a violent blizzard enveloped the world in its frigid embrace. The temperature plummeted, and the milky white veil of snow obscured everything in sight. The snowstorm, naturally, was summoned by the shadow of the winter beast. Somewhat weakened, but largely indifferent to the hurricane winds and the lethal cold, the fallen immortals continued. Moving forward, one of them had almost reached the middle points of the bridge when a black Ajiro suddenly fell from above, pinning him to the stone. The fiend struggled to break free, tearing his ghastly flesh in the process. A moment later, another arrow appeared noiselessly from the snow, severing his body in half. And then, as other fallen immortals overtook the bleeding body, colossal silhouettes suddenly dove at them from the snow. Those were the shadow wolves, tearing the abhorrent abominations apart with their enormous maws. Drowned by the howling of the wind, a quiet rustle followed them. Soon enough, the figures of the obsidian wasps rushed between the giant wolves, joining the massacre. And then, finally, beautiful ember patterns ignited in the veil of snow, stretching high into the air. They heralded the arrival of the Ember Queen. Slayer was standing on her enormous head, already knocking another arrow, and a great tide of the black millipedes flowed past her to join the fight. Among them was another millipede queen, this one seemingly forged from glistening onyx. It was Serpent, who had assumed that form for the moment. The dark surface of the bridge was rapidly covered by snow, and the snow was rapidly painted red by the blood of the monstrous immortals. But that was not all. Unseen in the blizzard, two currents of shadows extended on both sides of the bridge, spanning its length. Soon, they solidified into glistening obsidian, becoming bridges of their own. Their smooth surface was immediately hidden by the segmented carapaces of countless millipedes, who were rushing forward to attack the fallen immortals from the flanks. Saint commanded the forces of the Shadow Legion in the west, while Slayer commanded them in the east. That only left the middle bridge. The scene taking place there was no less stunning, albeit far more bizarre. Out there, in front of the bridge, the ornate buildings collapsed, raising a vast cloud of dust. And in that dust, a strange, huge silhouette revealed itself, moving slowly toward the chasm. Soon, the gigantic figure reached the bridge, revealing itself to be a towering, imposing dark castle. The castle moved across the rubble on 8 towering segmented legs, akin to a colossal spider. A titanic moth was perched on its tallest tower, and myriad strands of black silk extended from it east and west, bloating out the sky of the eternal city like an ethereal spider web. That was the marvelous Mimic, naturally. Both Mimic and the Puppeteer were currently enhanced by one avatar of Sunny, and every shade of the Shadow Legion capable of ranged attacks was currently manning the castle's walls. The shadows of Darren and the human saints were there, as well, while Goliath, the defiled seeker of truth, and the remnant of the Jade Queen were escorting it. The dark castle stepped onto the great bridge, instantly blocking its entire width, and continued moving forward. Soon enough, the defenders of its walls unleashed a devastating barrage of ranged attacks on the attacking immortals, reducing them to torn shreds of slithering flesh. 3 battles raged at the same time, and on each of the 3 bridges, the forces of the Shadow Legion were slowly advancing. There was a 4th battle happening at the same time, as well, hidden from view. Out there in the throne room of the Dark Castle, a deep shadow rested beneath the obsidian throne. It was Nightmare, having returned to its shapeless form. At the moment, the fallen immortals infected by his dream curse were locked in the maze of nightmares, shattering them one after another. At the same time, the seeds Nightmare had planted in them were growing, giving birth to new dreadful dreams. The tenebrous steed had to not only keep his prey contained within the maze and spread the dream curse to those of the immortals who were still awake, but also battle and subjugate each of the newborn nightmares, and do so faster than his prior minions were being destroyed, as well. The fury of that terrible battle was in no way inferior to what was happening in reality, and perhaps even more terrifying. Gods. Sunny and Jet had just reached the wharf by then. Standing on its walls, they glanced back, at the beautiful vista of the Eternal City. Jet took a deep breath. It was hard to see the details of the three battles from where they were standing, but what little they could see was already unimaginable enough. She remained silent for a few moments, then sighed. Why do I feel like I'm missing all the fun? Hearing her own words, Jet shook her head. Damn, we haven't known each other that long, but I already feel as if I've spent too much time with you. Sunny grinned. He opened his mouth, wanting to answer, but at that moment, a distant rumble distracted them both. Looking east, they saw something stunning. Out there, far away, the gigantic form of the clock tower was crumbling. The immense structure was breaking apart and folding in on itself, enormous chunks of stone falling down in clouds of dust and debris. The scale of this destruction was simply daunting. Sunny frowned. His own forces were nowhere near the western reaches of the Eternal City, and the Dutchman was far in the north. That only left the mysterious third contender. That thing, whatever it was, must have caused this scene. His frown deepened. Because fun things are happening. Turning away, Sunny headed toward the night garden. Let's go. There's no time to waste. 2643 Healing Process. The beauty and tranquility of the blooming wharf were in stark contrast with the dreadful carnage of the battle taking place on the other side of the island, especially for Sunny, whose consciousness was split between both. Walking to the inner edge of the wall with determined steps, he jumped off, plummeted about 100 meters, and landed softly on the bow of the night garden. Knave was standing guard there, listening to the distant clamor of the devastating battle with a concerned expression. Sunny's arrival seemed to alleviate some of his worry, and when Jet joined them, most of his tension disappeared. Glancing at the walls of the wharf, Knave exhaled slowly. What the hell is happening there? Sunny gave him a brief look. A dead army is battling an immortal army. It's quite grotesque. With that, he glanced around and asked. A better question is what's happening here. This wharf was supposed to repair the night garden, how is that going? Knave hesitated for a moment. Ether would be able to answer better, since he is in the runic hall, but in short, Nightwalker was right. The night garden is indeed being mended, although we are not quite sure what it means just yet. Sunny had already been reasonably confident of that fact, but it was good to receive a confirmation. As Jet studied her ship with curiosity, he asked. So, how long do you think it will take? Knave raised an eyebrow. Probably quite some time. Days, possibly weeks. Why? Sunny grimaced. Because we were hoping to take the night garden on a small voyage. The situation in the city is difficult, so having it at our disposal would be of great help. It was truly a blessing that the living ship was safe from the dreadful abominations populating the Eternal City already. If not for Darren and his runic array. Sunny shuddered to imagine what would have happened once they drew close to the sunken ruin. There was a good reason why the Serpent King had not only built a barrier around the city, but also left a warning to anyone wishing to explore it. Jet smiled. By difficult, he means that there's a myriad of detestable immortals, the Dutchman and its army of wraiths, and also something else entirely, which might be even more harrowing. The Lord of Shadows has unleashed his legion, and there are 3 battles between great and supreme beings happening at the same time. Oh, and that is just the beginning of the end of this expedition. She sighed. We want to take the night garden directly to the lighthouse, though, where the lineage of the storm god is hidden. So, can it sail? And more importantly, should we interrupt the mending process? Knave studied them both silently for a short while, then nodded. It can sail, and it doesn't matter whether we do or not. It was Sunny's turn to be surprised. It doesn't matter. Knave nodded calmly. You must keep in mind that the night garden is not a mundane ship. It is not merely an enchanted ship, either, instead, it is a living ship. So, the reality of how it is being repaired is different from how we would usually imagine it. He pointed at the deck beneath their feet. The wharf is not literally repairing its broken parts, like one would a mundane vessel. Rather, it is as if the wharf infused the night garden with a great torrent of vitality. That vitality, in turn, fueled the ability of the night garden to mend itself, much like a living being would heal naturally. So although we say that it is being repaired, in truth it is more like it's healing, he shrugged. So it doesn't matter that much if we stay docked or not. The process has already been initiated, so it will continue even if the night garden leaves the wharf. Sunny glanced at him for a while, then glanced at Jet. Then, he smiled. That's what I want to hear. The process of healing would probably reach its conclusion faster if the night garden remained in the blossoming birth, but it could continue unseen even if the living ship dove back into the crushing darkness of the Stormsia. This was truly great news, not only because it allowed Sunny to use the living ship in the battle for the Eternal City, but also because it gave them an opportunity to retreat without worry. Even if other goals of the expedition ended up not being achieved, the night garden would benefit. So, Sunny did not have to feel too worried anymore. Let us cast off, then. He looked at them with a smile, hesitated for a moment, and then added in a nonchalant tone. How do we do that, by the way? As it turned out, leaving the berth was just as easy as entering it. The night garden was currently connected to the wharf by the branches that supported its weight. Its hull and the berth had become a single whole, and therefore, the sorcery of the living ship expanded to contain the sorcery empowering the Titanic wharf, as well. So, the person controlling the night garden could control the wharf, too. Granted, there was no instruction manual on how to do it, nevertheless, Ether had been able to learn how to activate the simplest functions after a short period of experimentation. Soon enough, Sunny heard the sound of rushing water, and saw great waterfalls spilling into the vast reservoir of the berth. The water level rose slowly, and as it did, the wharf slowly retracted its branches one by one, separating itself from the living ship. Finally, the great gates of the gigantic wharf opened, and the dark expanse of water revealed itself once more. The night garden slowly glided out of the berth and reached the edges of the dome protecting the Eternal City. Then, turning its bow, it took course toward the lighthouse. 2644 Suffering from success. The Battle of the Three Bridges had began from a breathtaking explosion of violence, and as it progressed, the carnage only grew more harrowing. Facing the fallen immortals of the Eternal City, Sunny felt as if he was finally experiencing what it was like to face him and his Shadow Legion. Needless to say, that made him quite uncomfortable. It did not matter, really, how powerful his shades were or how finely he controlled their movements. The personal skill and valor of his shadows did not matter either. No matter how well they fought and how numerous enemies they killed, the fallen immortals inevitably returned to life and dove back into combat, their monstrous flesh bulging with lethal tendrils and morphing into terrible maws. The shades themselves could not be destroyed, but it took them much longer to return to the battlefield after being vanquished. So, time was not on Sunny's side. With a subtle shudder, he fully realized that his eventual defeat was inevitable. Sooner or later, the citizens of the Eternal City would completely obliterate the Shadow Legion and consume him. There was simply no escape. If he played by the rules, naturally, which Sunny had no intention of doing. Why follow the rules and lose when he could cheat and win? It's still a little disturbing, though. His own intent and ability to deal with the immortal prisoners of the Eternal City were a stark reminder that Sunny was not invincible, either. His shades were indestructible, true, but only until he met a being disinclined to follow the rules, as well. Immortality is really a curse. Or at least it could become one. On each of the three bridges, his shades were trying to achieve the same result through different means. Saints and her soldiers had built an impregnable wall and steadily weathered the tide of hungry flesh. Slayer and her beasts hunted down the enemies in the snow, while the defenders of the Dark Castle unleashed a storm of ranged attacks on the ghastly abominations, but their end goal was the same. Minimize their losses and gradually restrain the adversary until the dream curse takes hold. Defense, offense, and a combination of both. On the western bridge, the black millipedes had flanked the fallen immortals, who were now caught between them and Slayer's main force. The murderous Shadow herself had spent her quiver of powerful enchanted arrows and leapt into battle, assuming the form of a bizarre beast whose gigantic body and long tail were covered by impenetrable scales, and who could turn into an armored ball. The scales turned out to be all but indestructible. The tendrils of the fallen immortals, at least, failed to pierce them, while the immortals themselves were easily crushed by the rolling beast or torn apart by its sharp claws after it unfurled its giant body. Serpent moved in their midst, as well, shifting between various forms. On the middle bridge, the Dark Castle was steadily moving forward. Mimic was merely a transcendent shadow, but it was currently empowered by one of Sunny's incarnations, so, its walls had tuned durable enough to withstand the glancing attacks of the fallen immortals, even if just barely. Most of the abominations were torn to shreds by the ranged attacks of the defenders before reaching the castle, but in the end, numerous of them inevitably began to scale the walls. Reaching the battlements, they were met by the shadows of Darren and the human saints, cut down and swallowed by black chains. In front of the marching castle, on the bridge, the defiled seeker of truth expelled clouds of lethal miasma, the remnant of the Jade Queen breathed out torrents of caustic volcanic ash, while Goliath gazed upon the rushing abominations, washing everything it beheld in immolating heat. On the eastern bridge, a wall of black chitin was refusing to buckle under. An avalanche of hungry flesh. The Asuras of condemnation and the bestial horrors of Godrave advanced through the breaches in the phalanx of grotesque millipedes, crushing and severing the bodies of the fallen immortals. Fiend rampaged in front of the defensive formation, serving as its vanguard. Saints herself, meanwhile, had carved a bloody path to advance forward. Surrounded by monstrous horrors of the Eternal City from all sides, she calmly activated the Shield of Nothing and descended upon the detestable creatures, moving under a veil of true darkness. Sunny and the puppeteer controlled all three armies, tensely observing the changing currents of the battle. This is a problem. The fallen immortals were powerful, and there were a lot of them. Not all of these abominations had been humans once, either. There were bestial horrors among them, as well, each like a moving abyss of abhorrent, murderous flesh. However, Sunny had managed to bridge the divide between the Shadow Legion and the dwellers of the Eternal City with skill, strategy, and cohesion of his silent troops. The problem, however, was in the nature of this battle. Killing the enemies only slowed them down a little, and to truly deal with them, they had to be restrained and eventually infected by the dream curse. But while temporarily destroying the body of a fallen immortal was a task that an individual shade could accomplish, restraining them required continuous efforts of at least a couple of shades. Which meant that with each adversary Sunny neutralized, the number of his soldiers diminished, even if none of them were vanquished. Something had to change, and soon, it did. Just as Saint was finally forced to move back on the eastern bridge, a powerful explosion rocked it, and dozens of immortals in front of her were torn to pieces. A moment later, another explosion bloomed, and a powerful shockwave sent the adversary reeling. That was the Night Garden, sailing at the edge of the invisible barrier that protected the Eternal City while circling it from the east. As they left the wharf and passed the island, a perfect view of the eastern bridge and the battle happening on it opened to the right of the living ship. Which meant that its starboard cannons had a direct line of fire, and could unleash a destructive bombardment on the attacking immortals. There were no firing crews and ascended officers on deck to fuel the cannons with essence and load them, though. So, instead, Sunny loaded and aimed the cannons himself, summoning innumerable black hands from the shadows, then charged the cannon balls with his own supreme essence. As a series of explosions erased swaths of the advancing abominations from the Great Bridge, Saint and her army advanced rapidly. 2645 The more you learn. The bombardment of the Night Garden descended on the northern span of the Great Bridge, carving bloody paths in the tide of hideous flesh. A bloody haze drifted above the vast chasm, and pieces of torn bodies rained down. Saint retreated just in time to avoid being swept away in the lethal barrage, sliding back on the slick stone while plunging her sword into it to arrest her momentum. A split second later, she regained her balance and lunged forward, cutting down one of the fallen immortals who had escaped the first salvo of the Night Garden. Due to her monumental height, she looked like a towering statue from a distance. Fiend was at least 4 times higher. At that moment, however, his fearsome figure suddenly shrank, becoming only a head taller than her. His mass remained the same, though, so when he lunged forward to join Saint, the Great Bridge shook and quaked. Together, they massacred the vanguard of the immortal swarm. Fire and darkness intertwined like a primal inferno, reminding Sunny of the ancient murals depicting the flames of desire burning in the everlasting void. The Shadow Legion advanced. With the Night Garden bombarding the bridge, it was as if the roots of the immortal swarm had been cut. The hideous abominations were still quickly rising from the dead, but since the gargantuan cannonballs continued to decimate them, fewer managed to reach the line of battle contact intact, and because of that, the balance of power between them and the silent shades shifted. With fewer enemies to deal with, Saint and her army were able to restrain them faster, and once they gained that advantage, their progress snowballed. Standing on the deck of the Night Garden, Nave observed the distant battle with a stunned expression. This was his first time witnessing the Shadow Legion, or any sovereign going all out, for that matter, so he was reasonably taken aback. Eventually, he said in a low voice, "So this is your true power." Sunny, who had been busy loading and firing 12 gargantuan cannons of his own creation, gave him a sideways glance. "Technically, this is 1/3 of 5/7 of my true power. But it is close enough, I guess." Slowly, Knave's gaze turned subtly bitter. Looking away from the furious battle raging on the distant bridge, he sighed. "In the past, I've often wondered how things would have been different if the House of Night had managed to produce a sovereign. What would have happened if Nightwalker was still here?" Sunny smiled faintly. "I think you got it all wrong. Great clans do not produce sovereigns, it's the opposite. Sovereigns produce great clans. So, in a sense, the House of Night was the most impressive of the great clans, because you achieved that title without being supported by a supreme." Knave shook his head. "We were still wiped out, in the end. Even if we weren't, we were destined to fade into obscurity as valor and song conquered everything." He remained silent for a while, then glanced at Sunny and asked, "What does it feel like, to wield the power akin to a deity?" Jet, who was leaning against a wooden beam nearby, smiled. "Yes. What does it feel like?" Sunny did not answer immediately, concentrating on his myriad shades, the shadows he was manifesting, and firing the cannons. Eventually, he said, "I guess it makes you feel small." It was not the answer they expected, so both seemed surprised. "Small." Sunny nodded. "You are both saints, so you should understand. The more powerful you become and the more you learn, the more painfully you understand just how weak and ignorant you are. However, there is solace in anonymity. As a mundane person, you know that there are billions of people who are no different from you. As an awakened, there are hundreds of thousands, at least 100 as a saint. But there are only a few sovereigns. So being weak and ignorant feels much more personal." He paused for a moment and then chuckled. "Ah, but don't misunderstand. It's not all bad. In fact, being a demigod feels great. To be honest, my youth was quite miserable. Every day, I struggled just to survive. Now, I wouldn't even know how to die. Killing me is strictly a theoretical possibility." Having witnessed the state of the immortal dwellers of the Eternal City, however, Sunny was not as comforted by being nearly unkillable as before. On the bridge, Saint and her army were steadily making their way to the new island. With the support of the Night Garden, the pressure on her and her troops reduced by a large margin, so large, in fact, that Sunny could shift some of these forces elsewhere. So, he sent Fiend and fresh reinforcements to the other two bridges. Most importantly, he released Saint from the embrace of his shadow and sent that incarnation to augment the marvelous mimic, as well. With 3 of his avatars concentrated on the middle bridge, he could unleash the power of the curse and weaken the fallen immortals there better. These bridges were a perfect battlefield for the weakening curse, in fact, because only a limited number of enemies could attack his forces simultaneously there. That allowed him to concentrate the debilitating sorcery of the Shadowbound charm on the foremost enemies, thus maximizing its effectiveness. With reinforcements arriving from the eastern bridge, the situation on the other two had shifted, too. Slowly at first, then exponentially faster, the scales of battle began to tip in Sunny's favor. Once he gained an advantage, it only continued to grow. And before too long, the 3 battles reached their conclusion. Saint, Slayer, and the marvelous Mimic had crossed the bridges and entered the 3 islands, leading the Shadow Legion onto their shores. Of course, the conclusion of the battle for the 3 bridges did not mean that all combat ceased. The islands were teeming with ghastly, immortal abominations, so the battle continued, even if its intensity lessened. It had simply entered a new phase. 2646 Shadow Commander. The Night Garden had left the wharf, so Sunny saw no need to keep a presence on the island connected to it. Having cleansed it from the dreadful immortals, the Shadow Legion abandoned the territory it had previously conquered and advanced northward to 3 neighboring districts of the Eternal City. Each of the 3 islands was larger and more densely developed than the Wharf Island, and populated by more abominations, as well. The immortals dwelling there seemed slightly more powerful, with more champions akin to the abhorrent Silver Tiger hiding in their midst. One of the islands seemed like a residential area, one resembled a leisure district with vibrant shops and theaters scattered among peaceful alleys, while the last one was mostly taken up by an exquisite park. Gorgeous trees rustled quietly in the nebulous darkness, their silver leaves glistening in the rays of falling light. Ponds and winding canals rested under the black abyss of the watery sky above, and tall hills rose above the landscape, cascading toward the promenades built along the edges of the island. Saint and her army invaded the leisure district. Slayer led her bestial force into the residential One, while the Mervalis mimic entered the park. Each of the three forces was met with its own set of challenges, dictated both by its composition and the terrain of the three battlefields. The nature of the battle kept changing, and Sunny had to adapt rapidly. His legion was facing a far greater number of enemies now, so its numerical advantage did not play a large role anymore. The dream curse was not spreading among the restrained immortals fast enough, either, and Sunny did not have enough shades to keep restraining them indefinitely, so he had to keep releasing captured enemies despite knowing that they would attack him again. Additionally, the three islands were not only larger and more populous than the first one, they were also connected to more districts of the Eternal City, which meant that countless new abominations were already trickling across the wide chasms dividing them. Worse still, they were not arriving only from the north, but threatening to flank Sunny's forces on the residential and leisure islands. Things did not look too good for the Shadow Legion. However, the most important change in the cadence of the battle was a positive one. Sunny had not noticed it during the battle for the Wharf Island since it was relatively short and had been fought on a smaller scale than these. 3 harrowing collisions, but even the sorcery of the Eternal City was not omnipotent. The fallen immortals of this sunken hell could not be destroyed, indeed. Even if they were torn apart or burned to ash, the Eternal City would restore their youthful bodies to pristine condition, endlessly, no matter how countless times they perished. However, the time it took the immortals of the Eternal City to be revived varied. At first, it only took them mere seconds to rise again, but if the same nightmare creature was killed repeatedly, that time slowly increased. Already, some of the immortals whom the Shadow Legion had fought on the bridges spent entire minutes remaining dead. That was still incomparable to the silent shades of the Shadow Legion, since the more powerful of them needed entire days to return to the battlefield. However, it introduced an entirely new dynamic to the battle for the Eternal City, giving Sunny more tools to work with. The fallen immortals seemed to be slowly growing wary of the Shadow Legion as a result, not because they feared being destroyed by the Shades, but because they feared remaining dead for too long and surrendering their chance to eviscerate the enemy to someone else. So, the intestine of the combat lessened, somewhat, and it would probably keep changing as Sunny killed more nightmare creatures over and over again, slowing down their revival process. In these circumstances, the ruthless economy of battle had become even more important, forcing Sunny to concentrate on a particular aspect of warfare, the use of siege engineering and fortifications. Like a general commanding an army, well, an actual general commanding an actual army, rather, he had to conquer optimal positions on each of the 3 islands, entrench his forces, and slowly chip away at the swarm of immortal abominations. That was his priority at the moment. Luckily, Sunny possessed a unique advantage as far as fortifying battle positions went. In the leisure district, Saint and her army fought their way to a large structure that made him shudder, in secret, because of its similarity to the Colosseum of the Kingdom of Hope. It was a vast theater built in an elliptical shape, with towering walls with open arches and lavish spectator seats descending toward a wide track that circled the arena, a hippodrome, if he was not mistaken. The open nature of its walls made the hippodrome a hardly defensible position, even if its great size and overall shape made it perfect for establishing a stronghold. As Saint and her warriors poured into the ancient theater, the shadows around it stirred and flowed upward. They filled the wide portals cut into the walls of the hippodrome and then solidified, closing them. At the same time, a layer of manifested shadows reinforced the stone walls, making them harder to destroy. Wide battlements with protruding bastions were established on top of the walls, and an inclined palisade of sharp spikes rose from its base, making approach more difficult. Sunny was already straining himself to maintain the countless chains that bound the captured immortals, so he simply manifested these shadows permanently. That made them far less potent and far more brittle, but by overlaying multiple layers of manifested shadows on top of each other, he was able to vastly improve the resilience of the hippodrome. Remembering the many sieges he had ever participated in, Sunny implemented every measure he could realize in a short amount of time to make the ancient theater as difficult to conquer as possible. Soon, a dark fortress towered above the leisure districts, bristling with myriad black spikes. Saint stood atop its walls, shrouded in a mantle of darkness. Similar things were happening on the Park Island and the residential island, as well. 2647 Learning Curve. On the residential island, the blizzard summoned by the shadow of the winter beast had swallowed the lively streets, the private estates, and the groves surrounding ornate palatial manors. There was no easily defensible position here, so Sunny had to create one himself. Slayer and her bestial army had taken control of the roofs, with aerial bridges made from shadows connecting them like a web. The obsidian wasps were able to fly, even if they were vulnerable when taking to the air, so, they were both highly mobile and unpredictable, giving her a vital advantage. Serpent, meanwhile, was supremely adaptable, capable of supporting any strategy. And then there was the Ember Queen, naturally, the shadow of a great tyrant who was not only fearsome in battle, but also capable of commanding the black millipedes and extremely elusive. On the central island, the marvelous Mimic and its defenders had made it to the top of a tall hill, settling there like a natural fortress. Sunny covered his castle in a carapace of manifested shadows, as well, as if dressing it in a suit of armor. There were few terrain features to make use of here, but there was hardly a more tried and tested combination than a steep slope in the walls of a fortress. The only thing he was lacking was a deep moat, but even then, the hill bordered a deep lake on one side. Granted, the immortals of the Eternal City were not going to drown even if they fell into its water, but every advantage, no matter how small, mattered. Here they come. The forces entrenched themselves as best they could, preparing to be besieged. There was no trick Sunny could use, none that was worth the effort, at least, so he fully concentrated on his countless bodies, wanting to make the most of his combat skill and intelligence. It was quite fascinating, really. With the Mindweave enhancing his mental prowess and the puppeteer serving as the conduit of his will, Sunny had gained nearly flawless control over his shades. That meant that he could not only take full advantage of the rich legacy of tactical warfare accumulated by humanity over the ages, but also perform strategies that mundane generals had never even dreamed of. After all, Sunny had not simply gained the ability to command his dead warriors with the same level of responsiveness as mundane soldiers would have shown. Instead, he could directly control each of his shades, so, in fact, the level of cohesion he could achieve was far beyond anything mundane armies had even been capable of. On the most basic level, that was expressed in how well the shades supported each other in combat. The entire Shadow Legion was fighting like one vast, terrifying creature. It was as if Sunny had indeed become a demon with a myriad heads and a myriad deadly hands, sowing death and destruction anywhere he went. Naturally, that made each of the shades far more lethal, while at the same time drastically reducing the losses of the Shadow Legion. On a more elevated level, the unnatural cohesion between the countless shades allowed Sunny to perform strategic maneuvers that had not even been invented yet, since they were simply impossible for armies bound by the limitations of mundane warfare. The fact that he had been able to carve a bloody path to the advantageous locations and fortify them under constant harassment by the fallen immortals was already proof of that. But really, Sunny had not even begun to explore the new horizon of possibilities open to him now, and understandably so. After all, it was not easy to invent an entirely new framework of military doctrines based on a set of realities that could be applied solely to him. The knowledge of military strategy Sunny possessed was the result of thousands of years of accumulated insights and breakthroughs made by genius tacticians, so, he could not be expected to accomplish that much in a single day. He was certainly trying, though, driven by desperation and necessity. I do feel like I'm a little out of my depth. Which was ironic, considering that he was at the bottom of the deepest ocean in the universe. Sunny had commanded a small group of elite soldiers before, as well as a large contingent of the Sword Army in Godgrave. He had also led the Shadow Legion into battle, but never in such an involved and complicated manner. So, he was both struggling, and learning a lot, with every second of his endless, intensely violent, and harrowing battle. 3 tides of dreadful abominations descended upon the positions of the Shadow Legion. The violence was unimaginable. Sunny had been disturbed by the monstrous, sinister nature of the first immortal they had met in the Eternal City. Now that this one nightmare creature was replaced by a ceaseless flood of hideous, misshapen horrors, he could not even bother to be repulsed. But nevertheless, he was getting better at commanding his silent army with every moment. With every attack his soldiers received or delivered, Sunny was learning how to wield his power better. His vast mind spun frenetically, absorbing new information and coming to new conclusions. And as a result, the position of the Shadow Legion was slowly improving. On the Leisure Island, the tide of immortals was washing over the walls of the Hippodrome. On the Parquet Island, the defenders of the Dark Castle had established a killing field on the slopes of the hill. On the Residential Island, Slayer and her beasts were repelling the enemies who leapt or climbed onto the roofs of the few central blocks. And all the while, Nightmare continued to spread the dream curse among the fallen immortals. The tenebrous steed was fighting his own battle, as well. The maze of nightmares was being destroyed and rebuilt again, slowly expanding as more and more powerful creatures were imprisoned in it. Sunny just hoped that it would endure until the expedition to the Eternal City was over. Sweet dreams, bastards. 2648 Inherent inclinations. How are things going there? The Night Garden had moved past the battle on the bridge and was now sailing around an unknown island. The deafening cannonade had ceased, and only the distant echoes of the fierce battle were breaking the tense silence. Sunny was on the bow of the living ship, accompanied by Nave and Jet. Giving the latter a brief look, he sighed. Better than expected, worse than I would have wanted. Despite his best efforts, the Shadow Legion was still suffering casualties. If there was a consolation, though, it was that for every shade that was vanquished, several immortals were infected by the dream curse. The measures Sunny had taken and the fortifications he had built were doing their job. He could not tell if this was enough, though. It seemed like he would be able to conquer the 3 islands in due time while suffering relatively few losses, but would that rate of attrition be acceptable in the long term? There was no way to tell, yet, since the battle for the Eternal City was only starting. Sunny closed his eyes and rubbed his face, feeling as if his mind was on the verge of melting. As I mentioned already, I have established fortified strongholds on each of the 3 islands, for now. Currently, the locals are laying siege to them. Once that chaos subsides a little, I will probably try to accomplish a few secondary goals to gain more advantages. Jet raised an eyebrow. Secondary goals? Like what? He hesitated for a few seconds. I was thinking of trying to destroy one of the bridges. I'll need to find out what hides in the water, as well. The Eternal City used to drift in space, too, so I am sure that there is some kind of underground communications here. I'll need to explore them to see if there are tunnels that can be used to move around the islands rapidly. Oh, but most of all. Sunny turned his head slightly, looking north. When we were approaching the city, I noticed a building that glanced like it might be an armory. It will be great to go on a small excursion and see if I can arm my shades better there. After a short silence, Nave suddenly said in a neutral tone. I don't think that you'll find weapons in that building. Sunny looked at him steadily. Why? Nave lingered for a bit, then shrugged. The locals don't seem like militant people. Sunny blinked a couple of times. He was currently engaged in 3 distressing battles with swarms of rabid locals, so how were they not militant? On the other hand, he somewhat understood what Nave meant. The Saint of Night still explained himself, though. From what I've seen, this place was meant to be a sanctuary. A place of peace and prosperity where even death held no power. In other words, the people living here were not supposed to suffer. Plus, didn't you mention that the Eternal City used to exist in space? An armory suggests the existence of a military force and a need for weapons. Who would the inhabitants of the Eternal City even fight in space? Sunny stared at him silently. Nave was making a lot of sense. To his disappointment, Jet spoke at that moment. Still, that does not mean that there are no weapons in the Eternal City. When Sunny looked at her with a silent question in his EUS, he smiled and shrugged. Well, think about it. If weapons were not used for war, then why would they be used? He tilted his head a little. Was that a trick question? Where did people wield weapons except for the battlefield? Training schools? Or, his eyes glistened a little. Sports? Jet nodded. Yeah, people might become immortal, but some things never change. Sunny hesitated for a moment. Indeed, all he had to do to come up with this answer was ask himself where he had used weapons most often outside the usual battles. And the answer was simple, it was in the dreamscape. People were wired to enjoy conflict and competition, so sports thrived even in war-torn societies, but especially so in those that experienced long periods of peace. In the waking world, the most popular sport was dueling, and since battles between awakened were too perilous, it mostly took place in the dreamscape. Sunny knew better than most how popular these duels were, since he had suffered a lot of unintentional fame as mongrel. The same could be said about all cultures throughout Earth's history. The Dream Realm had not been an exception, either. The immortals of the Eternal City would have been even more susceptible to the excitement offered by sports competitions, since they could not even kill each other. War had been impossible or at least meaningless, but the deeply rooted need to experience strife all people shared would have remained. But how am I supposed to find where sports competitions? Sunny fell silent. Wait a minute, hadn't he already found one such place? The Hippodrome? Jet nodded. Chariot races were quite popular in ancient times. I would imagine something similar would have been happening here, as well, considering your description of the local hippodrome. Of course, the races themselves would have been different, with not only people, but also beasts and monsters participating, and everyone in the arena being immortal. Gods, I would have bought a ticket if I could. Sunny stared at her for a moment. Instead of answering, he simply commanded his incarnation in the hippodrome to separate itself from Saint, assume a tangible form, and descend to the floor of the arena. Sunny extended his shadow sense into the ground, and immediately sensed hollow spaces there. There was a whole network of service spaces under the hippodrome, rooms for the athletes, stables, training halls, lounges, and equipment storages, as well. Once Sunny sensed what was hidden inside, his eyes glistened. Ah, he lingered for a bit, then looked at Jet with a bright smile. I think I've found the first part of that treasure. 2649 ancient equipment. Without wasting any time, Sunny stepped through the shadow and found himself in a spacious corridor under the arena of the hippodrome. Jet must have been correct in her assumption that mythical beasts had participated in the chariot races held in the Eternal City. The corridor was wide, with high ceilings, and the gates leading to various halls were quite large as well. Sunny could easily imagine a lumbering creature, like the detestable silver tiger he had fought recently, walking on this path on its way to the arena. For a moment, his spirit of exploration flared up, making him space out while imagining the exciting games that had happened in the hippodrome, but Sunny was too preoccupied by something else to let himself go on a mental tangent, not to mention the fact that he was simultaneously controlling countless shades engaged in a fierce battle. Walking over to a particular gate, he pushed it open. Inside was a vast hall that must have served as a storage warehouse. The wares stored here were not of a mundane kind, though. Instead, hundreds of suits of intricate armor were displayed on wooden mannequins. The walls were lined with stands that bristled with all kinds of fearsome weapons: spears, swords, axes, mauls, tridents, bows and arrows, javelins, glaives, halberds, anything he could imagine. What was more, those were not ordinary suits of armor or ordinary weapons. Sunny had forged enough of them to know quality when he saw it. Each was worthy of being worn or wielded by a transcendent being, at least. A few, those that were displayed on ornate pedestals, were even fit for a supreme. Both the armor and the weapons were enchanted, as well. Sunny could see a flowing webby of runes etched into the glistening steel, and although he could not tell what enchantments the runes created, he sensed dire power emanating from the ancient blades. Everything here had been preserved in pristine condition, just like everything else in the Eternal City. At least 1,000 sets of armor and countless weapons were stored in this hall alone. It was an arsenal that put the armories of great clans to shame. Sunny was suddenly regretful that there were so few human shades in the Shadow Legion. Should he have killed more people, perhaps? No. Probably not. But even if he could not bestow these armaments on most of his shades, there were plenty of warriors in the human domain who could benefit greatly from receiving such potent tools. Sunny hesitated for a few seconds, then walked over to a pedestal that stood in the very center of the armory, illuminated by an enchanted lantern. There, an imposing suit of lamellar armor that seemed to have been forged from radiant nacre scales was resting on a mannequin, its head crowned by a laurel wreath. A fearsome spear rested nearby. This set especially radiated a feeling of history and dire power. It had probably belonged to an immortal champion of the Eternal Arena. Sunny could not help but think that it would suit the Shadow of Darren quite well, at least during this expedition. It's a pity, though. Most of the shades Sunny commanded belonged to nightmare creatures, so these beautiful weapons and suits of armor were useless to them. He still sent the entire arsenal into his soul sea, though. From there, the best equipment could be summoned to the human shades. Slayer, meanwhile, would receive full quivers of deadly enchanted arrows. Sunny could not help but think that there had to be a similar arsenal meant for great beasts somewhere in the hippodrome, too. He searched it with his shadow sense, but did not discover anything that resembled immense suits of armor. There was a different point of interest, though. Stepping through the shadows, Sunny found himself in a different vast hall. There, enormous pools of something that looked like mercury were cut into the stone floor, surrounded by runic circles. Sunny studied the pools for a while, wondering what purpose they served. He glanced around the hall, then considered the layout of the underground complex hidden under the arena. Then, he walked over to one of the runic circles and stared at the runes. Form, shape, boundary, hell, I can't make sense of it. He did have a peculiar suspicion, though, one that he felt had a good chance of reflecting the truth. Eventually, Sunny stepped back and summoned one of the shades that were guarding the battlements into the underground hall. Soon, an enormous leopard appeared in front of him, towering at least a dozen meters above the floor. Unlike some of the shades, this one was not clad in armor forged by the shadow of the King of Swords, so it was a perfect choice to conduct an experiment. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then commanded the leopard to enter one of the pools. The mercury rippled as the colossal beast submerged itself into the pool. Shades did not need to breathe, of course, and the liquid metal did not seem dangerous. Still, Sunny called the leopard back before too long. As the giant shade rose from the mercury, torrents of liquid metal flowed down its black fur. However, not all of that metal returned into the pool. Instead, a layer of it solidified around the body of the leopard. Sunny's eyes shook a little. By the time the giant beast stepped back onto the cold stones, it was encased in polished armor. The mercury did not just solidify around it, instead, it was shaped and guided to turn into an actual suit of armor that was perfectly suited for the body of the bestial shade, protecting all its vital spots while leaving enough open areas not to compromise its mobility. It was incredibly resilient, too, capable of withstanding most of Transcendent Blades, at least, or corrupted claws. Great nightmare creatures would not find it easy to break this armor, either. As Sunny looked at the heavily armored black leopard, his eyes glistened. That's what I'm talking about. 2650 Commerce and Culture. While the three strongholds of the Shadow Legion were besieged by the tide of monstrous flesh, the Night Garden continued sailing toward the distant lighthouse. Sunny had already begun arming his shades, but it was going to take some time to exhaust the pools of liquid metal and equip as many of them as he could. He moved the shades that had already received shiny new coats of enchanted armor to the front line, though, so the rate at which the Shadow Legion was suffering casualties was already reducing. It's amazing, really. At the moment, Sunny and Jet were with the Saints of Night on the bridge of the living ship. He was showing them one of the weapons from the arsenal of the Hippodrome. I knew that there would be something of value in the Eternal City, but I might have underestimated just how much of a treasure trove this place is. It was inhabited by truly powerful beings, after all, and unlike most other places in the Dream Realm, everything here had been perfectly preserved. The Hippodrome alone can increase the overall strength of humanity by a noticeable margin. Bloodwave nodded somberly, then said in his low voice, 1,000 sets of transcendent armor, all of House of Night only possessed a tenth of that. Not to mention supreme relics. There were more powerful memories out there now that the number of saints had increased, but it was still an incredible discovery. Even if the artifacts found in the Eternal City were not memories, and were therefore more cumbersome to use, they were a precious commodity. Not only because of their power, but also because of the fact that they were enchanted, and the fact that these enchantments had come from a previously unknown tradition. Just like Anenki's mantle had helped Sunny develop his weaving, the runic enchantments of these ancient relics could help human enchanters learn more about sorcery, and therefore push their craft further. Jet whistled, then asked, "Where else do you think we'll be able to find something valuable?" The Hippodrome was an unexpected find, but there were bound to be other similar places in the Eternal City. Nave contemplated for a while, then said tentatively, "Stores. There had to be stores selling enchanted items. Even immortals would have enjoyed luxury. It would be even better to find workshops where the items were crafted." At that moment, the usually quiet Ether suddenly spoke. "Museums." He glanced at Sunny and Jet, then added quietly, "People who lived in this city were made immortal, but they had all come from somewhere. The wealth of history they had witnessed must have been immeasurable, and they would have brought mementos of that history here. Since they lived lives of opulence and luxury, knowing no need, they would have enjoyed culture more than commerce." He smiled. "Who knows what we will find in their museums? Relic of the Age of Gods, mythical weapons that decided the fate of entire realms, that is what one imagines when thinking about an immortal abode." Sunny blinked a couple of times. Museums, huh? Ether's suggestion was quite plausible, not to mention enticing. Just then, an especially powerful abomination clashed with Slayer, and Sunny got distracted for a while. When the nightmarish horror was finally subdued, he shivered. The more time Sunny spent in the Eternal City, the more a particular question gnawed at him. Glancing at the Saints of Night, he exhaled slowly, and then asked, "Now that I've enjoyed the sights of this lovely city, I wanted to ask, how the hell did Nightwalker escape from here as a sleeper?" Nave and Ether, in turn, glanced at Bloodwave, the oldest of them, as well as the person who seemed to have known the legendary founder of the House of Night personally. Bloodwave remained silent for a while, then sighed. "That is Nightwalker you are talking about, the first of the Night Guides." That bastard could find any path and go anywhere he wanted, and nothing could stop him, let alone bar his way. It sounded like Nightwalker had possessed an aspect that had to do with getting places. It also sounded like Bloodwave had not been very fond of the mysterious founder of their clan, for some reason. Ether wore a neutral expression, while Knave's emotions could not be read. Sunny sighed. Well, I'm in no position to judge. Did you know, I once killed a great devil as a SLEE. They chuckled politely, prompting his expression to fall. Ah, it is just not the same without Kai. Soon enough, he winced and raised a hand to shield his eyes. The closer they got to the lighthouse, the brighter their surroundings became. Most of the Eternal City was shrouded in nebulous darkness, with Ares bathed in stark silver light. It was a city of endless night, alien to the concept of sunshine. As they approached the lighthouse, however, it was easy to mistake the deep darkness of the undersea for daylight, and Sunny suspected that it would become even brighter as they got closer still. The lighthouse, just like the wharf, was isolated from the rest of the city, standing some distance away from the nearest island. It was a magnificent tower that loomed above the landscape, almost reaching the sloping edge of the invisible dome. Radiant light spilled from it, suffusing the clouds of vapor surrounding its base with blinding, soft radiance. Sunny had felt nothing when nearing the wharf, but the sight of the lighthouse filled him with awe and dread in equal proportions. He hesitated. Lamb, not sure that we should take the night garden close to the tower. Jet gave him a brief look and nodded. There is no dock, anyway. We will stop at a safe distance away. Knave seemed to agree, as well. How will we get to ground, though? That was indeed a good question. Sunny glanced at the turbulent expanse of glistening water and winced. I guess we're going for a swim.